It's cold, and it's just the two of us here. We have no other choice but to, said the Apache woe. The wind howled through the empty landscape like a wild animal. Snowflakes whipped across the sky, stinging the faces of the two people who were struggling to stay upright. They were not far from the edge of a frozen lake, but the ground was slippery, and each step felt like a battle against the cold itself. The tall trees around them were coated with frost, and their branches cracked and groaned under the weight of ice. Every sound echoed eerily through the silent white world, making it feel as though the forest itself was alive, watching them, judging them. The two of them, a man and a woman, had set out that morning thinking it would be a simple journey, maybe even an adventure. They had planned to spend a few hours exploring the woods near the edge of the mountains, enjoying the quiet and the crisp winter air. Neither of them expected how quickly things could change. What had started as a day of excitement had turned into a struggle for survival. Their phones had no signal, and the storm had come out of nowhere faster than they could have imagined. Now they were alone, truly alone, with only each other to rely on. He glanced at her, noticing the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes darted nervously around. But she was shivering uncontrollably despite the thick layers she wore. He wanted to say something reassuring, but he couldn't find the words. The words didn't exist for the kind of fear they were facing. The cold wasn't just outside, it was creeping into their bones, making every movement harder, every thought slower. He took a deep breath and tightened his scarf, trying to ignore the numbness in his fingers. They had been walking for hours, or at least it felt like hours. Time had lost all meaning here, swallowed by the endless white and the roaring wind. Pest. Their path, which had seemed clear in the morning, was now invisible, covered under fresh snow. Every familiar landmark was hidden, and every step forward seemed like a guess. One wrong move could mean falling into the icy water of the lake, or getting trapped in a snowdrift. He had already fallen once and had barely managed to pull himself out, his gloves wet and frozen. The thought made him shiver, even though he was trying to stay calm.
She spoke finally, her voice barely audible over the storm.
It's cold, and it's just the two of us here. We have no other choice but to... Her voice trailed off, swallowed by the wind. The sentence remained unfinished, but he understood perfectly. There was no one else coming to help them. They had to depend entirely on themselves. He nodded silently, his jaw tight, and offered her his arm. She took it, grateful for the small warmth of contact. They moved slowly, carefully picking their way through the icy terrain. Paris. Every step was exhausting. Snow had begun to fall heavier, sticking to their coats and hats, making them wet and heavier with every passing minute. They were both hungry, though neither had thought much about food since the storm had started. Their stomachs protested quietly, a constant reminder that this was no longer a simple outing. They had to conserve energy, but even that was difficult when every step felt like climbing a mountain. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. The forest stretched endlessly around them, a frozen maze with no clear direction. Occasionally they spotted a tree bent strangely or a rock sticking out of the snow, but none of it looked familiar. The world was a blur of white and gray, and their minds began to play tricks. Shadows moved where there were none. The wind whispered in strange patterns that sounded almost like voices. Each time she shivered violently, he could feel her fear, and it made his own heart race faster. They needed shelter, somewhere to stop and rest, even briefly. They scanned the area looking for anything, a hollow tree, a fallen log, anything that could block the wind. Finally, they spotted a small rise in the land, a place where the snow had not piled as heavily. Behind it was a small grove of trees, their branches forming a rough, natural roof. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a brief respite from the storm. They stumbled over to it, teeth chattering, and huddled together as best they could. Inside their little refuge, the silence was almost deafening compared to the storm outside. They could hear the wind hitting the trees, the ice cracking somewhere nearby, and the faint sound of snow sliding from branches.
She pulled her coat tighter around herself and shivered again.
He pulled his scarf up over his nose and took a deep breath, trying to calm the rising panic in his chest. They had survived this far, but for how long? The thought was terrifying. He looked around, trying to assess their situation. They had no way to call for help, no food, and limited supplies. If they stayed here, they could freeze. If they moved, they could get lost completely. Both options were dangerous, but doing nothing was not an option. He caught her looking at him with wide, fearful eyes and realized she was waiting for him to make the decision. For a moment, he felt the weight of responsibility crush him. "Okay," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear he felt. "We have to keep moving. We can't stay here." She nodded silently, trusting him completely.
They wrapped their arms around each other as they stepped back into the blinding white, walking carefully, one step at a time. Every step was a small victory.
Every step was a decision to survive. The forest seemed endless, but they continued, driven by a mixture of fear and hope. They talked little, conserving energy and focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. Occasionally he would glance at her, reassuring himself that she was still with him. They were alone in a hostile world, but they still had each other. That small truth was enough to keep them moving, even when the cold was unbearable, even when their muscles screamed and their minds began to tire. Night began to fall, though it was impossible to tell because the sky was so gray and filled with snow. The world became darker, colder, more threatening breaths. Shadows lengthened strangely, and the snow-covered landscape became a maze of shapes and forms. They could see barely a few feet ahead, and every sound made them jump. The wind seemed louder now, sharper, almost alive. It was testing them, daring them to give up. But they could not. They pressed on, step by step, word by word, encouraging each other. Psst. She whispered memories of home to herself. And he remembered the faces of his family, the warmth of a fire, the comfort of a simple meal. Those memories were bittersweet, but they kept the fear from taking over completely. Slowly, inch by inch, they moved through the cold, relying entirely on their courage, their strength, and the fragile bond between them. By the time they finally found a small frozen clearing, their clothes were soaked, their fingers and toes numb, and their bodies exhausted. They sank to the ground, leaning against a tree, and finally allowed themselves to rest. They could feel the cold seeping into their bones. But for the first time in hours, they felt a tiny spark of relief. They were alive. They were together. And for now, that was enough. The storm still raged around them, and the night was far from over. But they had taken the first step in surviving the impossible. They had faced the wild, the cold, and the fear, and they had not given up. Somewhere deep inside, they knew this was only the beginning. The real struggle was still ahead, but they would face it together. Whatever choice they had to make next, they would make it side by side. Breath. And in that moment, in the heart of the storm, they discovered something they could never have imagined. The strength to keep moving, even when the world seemed determined to stop them. The night seemed endless, and the cold had grown sharper, biting through their clothes like tiny needles. They huddled together against the trunk of the tree, their shared warmth the only comfort against the harsh wind. Sleep was impossible. Every time their eyes closed, the sounds of cracking ice and groaning branches woke them, reminding them how fragile their situation was. The storm outside seemed to mock them, blowing snow into their makeshift shelter, turning it into a cage of cold and white. The man tried to think clearly, to plan the next move. They could not stay here for long. The forest, though it offered some cover, was dangerous at night. Predators might not be visible in the snow, but they could sense the humans. And even if there were no animals, the cold alone was enough to take them if they lingered too long. His mind raced, weighing every possibility, every path forward, but the landscape was unfamiliar, a maze of frozen trees and drifts that seemed to stretch endlessly. The woman stirred and whispered, "Do you think we'll make it through the night?" Her voice trembled, and he felt a pang of guilt. He wished he had an answer, a reassurance that he could give her, but there was no certainty in the wild. All he could do was keep moving, keep surviving, one step at a time. He squeezed her hand gently and said, "We'll make it. We have to. We'll find a way." His words were meant to be comforting, but even he struggled to believe them fully. The storm began to ease slightly, though the snow still fell steadily. They decided to move, realizing that staying in one place too long was too dangerous. Every movement was an effort, their muscles stiff from cold and exhaustion. The snow crunched beneath their boots, each step echoing eerily in the quiet forest. Visibility was limited, and they had to navigate carefully to avoid hidden hazards. Deep drifts, frozen streams, and jagged rocks covered by snow. They moved slowly, using the trees as guides and markers, trying to stay aware of every sound, every movement around them. The cold was relentless. Fingers and toes had become numb despite gloves and thick socks, and every breath they took seemed to freeze in the air before them. The woman stumbled, slipping on a hidden patch of ice, and he caught her just in time.
Careful, he whispered, his voice tight with tension.
"We can't afford an injury now." She nodded, silently grateful for his support, but fear was etched across her face. Hunger had started to gnaw at them, though neither wanted to admit it. They had left the house that morning with snacks and water, but now those supplies were gone, or frozen beyond use. The man remembered the small pack of food he had tucked away in his jacket, but opening it in the snow seemed impossible without exposing themselves to the storm. They decided to keep moving, hoping to find a better place where they could rest and eat. But even the thought of eating was daunting when their hands were so numb that opening the pack seemed impossible. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Every direction looked the same, an endless white expanse broken only by dark tree trunks. Shadows moved strangely in the storm, and the mind began to play tricks. The woman began talking to herself softly, counting steps, naming trees, repeating memories, to keep her mind busy. The man focused on keeping his own mind alert, scanning constantly for anything that could guide them. A distant ridge, the sound of flowing water, even the faint glow of a frozen lake under the snow. They reached a shallow depression in the ground where the snow had drifted less heavily. Here, the wind seemed slightly weaker, and they took the chance to pause. Leaning against a small cluster of trees, they tried to rest briefly, conserving energy. Their hands were swollen and stiff, faces red and chapped, eyes watery from cold and exhaustion. They shared a glance that said everything: the fear, the uncertainty, the stubborn determination to survive. They were alone, truly alone, and had no one to rely on but each other. The man looked around, trying to assess their options. He knew the storm would not last forever, but the cold could be deadly if they didn't find shelter soon. He remembered hearing about a ranger station not far from here, though it was a risky path to take in this blizzard. They had no map, no GPS, only intuition and memory to guide them. "We have to find shelter," he said firmly. "We can't stay here. If we keep moving slowly, carefully, we can make it." She nodded again, though fear was clear in her eyes. They set out once more, moving with extreme caution.
Every step was a struggle, the snow heavy, the cold unrelenting.
They passed frozen streams that could have been deadly if misstepped, jagged rocks hidden beneath snow, and trees coated in ice that threatened to break and fall. The forest was a challenge in itself, and they had to focus entirely on the path, leaving little room for conversation. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the occasional gust of wind. Eventually, they came across a small stream, partially frozen. The sight of running water was a small relief. They paused, trying to drink, though their hands shook so badly they could barely hold the containers. Water was vital. Dehydration could become a serious problem, even in the cold. The man broke through a patch of ice with his hand to let a few drops flow into a bottle, and they took turns drinking slowly. The small task was exhausting, but it gave them a tiny sense of control over the situation. As they moved on, exhaustion began to hit harder. Their bodies ached from hours of walking through snow, from cold, from tension. Every joint felt stiff, every step heavier than the last. The woman's legs trembled, and she stumbled more frequently. He offered his arm each time, guiding her carefully. "We're almost there," he whispered, even though he wasn't certain. Every promise of safety felt fragile, yet they had no choice but to believe it. The wind picked up again, stronger than before, and snow fell in thicker sheets. Visibility was nearly zero, and they could barely see each other unless they stayed very close. They moved side by side, their hands brushing occasionally for warmth, their eyes scanning constantly for any sign of danger. The forest felt endless, a frozen world that could swallow them at any moment. They had to remain alert, every instinct alive, every sense stretched to its limit. Suddenly a noise made them both stop. A branch snapped nearby, and they froze, hearts racing. For a moment they imagined a wild animal, a predator waiting to strike. But it was only the wind, twisting the trees, breaking ice from the higher branches. They exhaled in relief but did not relax, knowing the forest could still be unforgiving. Every sound reminded them of how vulnerable they were, how thin the line between safety and danger could be. And despite they spotted something unusual. But finally they spotted something unusual. A small mound of rocks that looked like a natural shelter, partially covered by a fallen tree.
It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They scrambled toward it, using it as a shield from the wind.
Inside, the snow had not piled heavily, and they could huddle together in slightly better protection. Exhausted, cold, and hungry, they sank to the ground, allowing themselves a few minutes of rest. They ate a few crumbs of food they had saved, drinking more water from the stream they had passed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them a small boost. The woman leaned against him, shivering but slowly calming down. The man pulled his scarf tighter around both of them, feeling the weight of responsibility more than ever. They were alone in a harsh world, with only each other to depend on. It was terrifying, but also strangely empowering. They had survived this far. As night began to fall again, they realized that even this small shelter would not keep them safe forever. The storm could return, the cold could worsen, and exhaustion could overtake them. They had to make a plan, a decision about what to do next. They discussed options quietly, weighing the risks of staying versus moving. Every choice carried danger, but inaction was not safe. Slowly, carefully, they decided that at first light they would try to make their way toward what they hoped was a ranger station, a place where help might be waiting. For now they rested as best they could, leaning against each other for warmth, sharing quiet words to keep spirits up. They reflected on how fragile life could be, how quickly a day of adventure could turn into a struggle for survival. But yet, despite fear and exhaustion, there was determination in their hearts. They would not give up. They had each other, and that was enough to keep moving forward, even when the world seemed determined to stop them. Morning came slowly, but it brought no warmth. The sky was a heavy gray, and snowflakes drifted lazily down from the clouds above. The storm from the night before had calmed slightly, though the air was still sharp and bitter. The man and woman stirred, their bodies stiff and sore, muscles aching from hours of sleeping in the cold. They wrapped their coats tightly around themselves, trying to shield what little warmth remained. Their breaths formed clouds in the frigid air, disappearing almost immediately into the vast whiteness around them. They looked at each other, and without speaking, understood that today would be different. Today they had to move. The small shelter they had found had provided only temporary protection. The snow was already starting to drift back into their resting place, and the temperature was dropping with every passing minute. Staying here could mean freezing, and moving blindly could mean getting lost. Neither option felt safe, but one thing was clear. They could no longer remain in place. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low but steady. She nodded, gripping his arm for support. The cold had left both of them feeling weaker than usual, and each step required immense effort. They began slowly, testing the snow-covered ground, careful not to slip or fall. Every movement was calculated. Each step forward was a battle, but they knew it was the only way to survive. The path ahead was treacherous. Snow had covered landmarks, and the forest looked like a vast, unbroken sea of white. The man tried to remember the directions he had guessed the day before, using the position of the trees, a distant ridge, and the slope of the land as guides. The woman followed closely, leaning on him when the wind struck too sharply or when her legs threatened to give way. The bond between them had grown stronger in these hours of fear and struggle, a silent understanding that they could only survive if they trusted each other completely. As they moved, a sudden gust of wind knocked them off balance. He caught her just in time. Their bodies pressed together for warmth and support. The snow stung their faces, but neither could pause for long. Breaking down, they pressed onward, driven by a mixture of fear and determination. Hunger gnawed at them, but food was secondary to finding safety. Their thoughts were entirely focused on the immediate danger: the cold, the snow, the wind, and the unknown path ahead. Hours passed, and the landscape remained unchanging, almost cruelly indifferent to their struggle. Fatigue began to set in. Their legs felt like lead, their arms ached from constant effort, and their faces were raw from exposure. The woman stumbled, and this time he could feel the strain in her grip. "We can't stop," he said firmly, though his voice betrayed the exhaustion he felt as well. "We have to keep going." She nodded, biting back tears, and forced herself to take another step, then another, until their bodies moved almost automatically through the snow. They soon reached a frozen river, its surface glistening in the pale morning light. It was wider than they expected, and the ice looked thin in places. Crossing it was risky, but they had no choice. The man stepped forward cautiously, testing each section with a long branch, while she followed closely behind. The ice creaked ominously under their weight, sending shivers down their spines. For a moment it felt as if the river itself was challenging them, daring them to continue. But they pressed on, slow and deliberate, each step bringing them closer to the other side. Halfway across, the ice cracked loudly beneath the woman's foot. She froze, panic flashing in her eyes. He lunged, grabbing her arm just as the crack widened. Heart racing, he pulled her to safer ground. They paused, shaking, both realizing how fragile their situation was. "We can't hesitate," he said, his voice tense but calm.
"Every second we wait, the danger grows."
Right. She swallowed hard, nodding, and together they finished crossing the river, relief flooding them even as their bodies screamed with fatigue.
On the other side, they stumbled into a grove of trees that offered slight shelter from the wind.
They took a moment to rest, leaning against a tree and catching their breath. They shared a small handful of food, crumbs, and dried fruit, barely enough to keep their strength from fading completely.
Even these tiny bits of nourishment felt like a luxury after the ordeal they had endured. The woman's fingers were so stiff that opening the packages had been nearly impossible, but they had managed.
It was a small victory, a reminder that survival was about persistence, about finding hope in the smallest things. As they continued, the snow began to fall more heavily again. The landscape became a blur of white, the horizon disappearing entirely. They realized that they had to make a critical decision. Ahead, the land sloped upward toward what they hoped was a small ridge. If they could reach it, they might spot a sign of civilization, maybe even a ranger station. But the climb was dangerous. The slope was steep, covered in ice and fresh snow. One wrong step could mean sliding down uncontrollably, injuries, or worse. Ooh. He looked at her, searching her eyes for any hint of fear. "We have no other choice," he said quietly. "We have to climb. It's risky, but staying here is worse." She nodded, swallowing hard. They began the ascent slowly, testing each step before committing their weight, sliding a little with every move, gripping rocks and roots as best they could. The wind fought them every step, pushing snow into their faces, making visibility almost zero. Their fingers and toes were numb, muscles screaming with effort, but they refused to give up. Halfway up the slope, the woman slipped, sliding down a short distance before he lunged and grabbed her coat. Psst. She clung to him, trembling violently. We can't stop now," she gasped, voice shaking. "If we fall, we'll—" She couldn't finish, pulling her upright, pressing her body against his for warmth and stability. "No!" he said firmly. "We keep moving, one step at a time. Together, that's all we can do." They continued, step by step, their bond carrying them through the terror and fatigue. The climb felt endless. Every rock, every icy patch, every drift of snow was a new challenge. They could hear the wind howling around them, the trees groaning under the weight of snow, the ice cracking beneath their feet. The woman's energy waned, her steps slowing, her balance faltering. He realized that the only way they would survive was if they relied entirely on each other. Breaths, with each step he guided her, pulling her when needed, supporting her weight, and constantly reminding her to keep moving. Finally, as exhaustion threatened to overtake them completely, they reached the top of the ridge. The view was almost too much to process. Endless white stretches of forest and frozen rivers, the world silent except for the wind. But in that vastness they spotted something, a faint structure in the distance. It was small, partially hidden by trees, but it was unmistakably a building. Hope surged through them like a sudden warmth. It was a ranger station, or at least a shelter. It was salvation, though it was still far enough to make the final approach dangerous. They paused, breathing heavily, looking at each other with a mix of relief and fear. "We can make it," he said, voice low but determined.
We have to. One step at a time.
Together. She nodded, drawing strength from his words. They began the final push, moving carefully down the slope and across the icy terrain toward the distant building. Every step was still treacherous, but the thought of safety drove them forward. Halfway to the building, the woman's foot caught in a hidden drift, sending her tumbling forward. The man lunged, grabbing her just before she hit the ice. They both fell onto their knees, snow sticking to their wet clothes, breaths ragged. The near fall reminded them how fragile life was in this harsh world. They looked at each other silently, acknowledging that each decision from this point on could be life or death. But they had come too far to turn back now. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, they reached the steps of the building. The man pushed the door and it opened with a creak, revealing warmth and shelter inside. Their bodies shook, not just from the cold but from the relief of having survived the critical choice they had just faced. They stepped inside, closing the door against the wind and snow, and collapsed onto the floor, exhausted but alive. For a moment, they allowed themselves to simply breathe, to feel the safety of being indoors, even if temporary. They had faced the wild, the storm, and the treacherous climb, and they had survived. The critical choice, to keep moving despite exhaustion, cold, and fear, had carried them through. They knew the danger was not fully over, but for now, they had won a small victory. They had survived, and that was enough to give them the strength to face whatever came next. The moment they stepped inside the small building, a wave of warmth washed over them like a miracle. The cold that had gripped their bones for hours began to loosen its hold, and they could finally feel their fingers and toes again. Brief moment, they allowed themselves to relax, collapsing onto the hard wooden floor, leaning against the walls, and breathing in the quiet hum of the shelter. They were alive. They had survived the storm, the frozen river, and the treacherous climb. It was a victory, small but powerful, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, they felt safe. But even in the warmth, exhaustion hung heavy on them. Every muscle in their bodies ached. Their minds were foggy from fatigue, and the hunger that had been gnawing at them for hours refused to be ignored. They rummaged through their packs, discovering what little food they had left, and shared it quietly. The crumbs of bread, a few pieces of dried fruit, and some water did little to restore their strength, but it was enough to remind them that survival was still within reach.
Every small effort mattered. Every bite counted. Every drop of water was precious.
The building itself was old but sturdy. Wooden beams supported the roof, and small windows let in faint light from the snow-covered world outside. It smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke, though no fire had burned here in years. The man ran his hands over the walls, checking for anything useful. Old tools, firewood, or blankets. They found some dried branches in a corner, enough to attempt a small fire, and with careful effort they managed to get a tiny flame going. The warmth was modest, but it felt miraculous. For the first time since the storm began, they could feel a part of themselves returning to life. Sitting close together near the small fire, they allowed themselves a few quiet words, and she spoke softly, almost whispering, about the fear she had felt, the moments she thought they might not make it. He listened, holding her hand, comforting her, without speaking too much. Words could not fully capture the relief, the exhaustion, or the small hope that had returned. They sat in silence for long stretches, letting the fire and each other's presence heal the smallest parts of their frayed nerves. But even in this temporary safety, the world outside remained dangerous. The storm had passed for now, but snow continued to fall lightly, and the cold was far from over. They could not stay here forever. Eventually, they would have to leave this fragile sanctuary and continue the journey toward real safety. A ranger station, a village, or even just a road where someone might pass.
Every thought reminded them of how fragile their situation was.
Comfort could not lull them into carelessness. The wilderness did not forgive mistakes. As the hours passed, they began to plan their next move. They studied the landscape outside, peering through the frost-covered windows. The trees were still weighed down with ice, the snow deep, and the wind had not completely stopped. The path forward would be dangerous, perhaps even more dangerous than what they had already endured. They needed a strategy, careful, deliberate, and patient, perhaps. Every step had to count. The man marked their position in his mind, trying to remember landmarks, shapes of trees, and the slope of the land. descent. Each detail could be the difference between life and death. Even as they planned, exhaustion continued to press down on them. Sleep was necessary yet dangerous. If they slept too long, the cold could creep back into their bodies, sapping their strength. They decided to take turns resting, keeping one person awake at all times to monitor the building and the faint sounds of the forest outside. The system was far from comfortable, but it gave them a sense of control, a way to fight back against the chaos of the wild. They huddled together when awake, drawing warmth from each other, and when one slept, the other stayed alert, listening for danger. Hours passed slowly, marked by the faint flicker of the fire and the soft fall of snow outside. They shared memories to distract themselves from fear. Stories of childhood, favorite places, and small moments of happiness. Laughter came softly at first, hesitant, then a little stronger breath. In those moments they felt a fragile thread of humanity, a reminder that life could continue even in the harshest circumstances. The forest outside remained a frozen, dangerous place, but inside there was warmth, hope, and the presence of someone who cared deeply. Despite this small reprieve, danger soon reminded them that the world outside was relentless. A loud, cracking noise echoed from the roof, a heavy branch breaking under the weight of ice. Spray. Snow fell from the eaves, startling them both. The building, shelter, was not invincible. They checked carefully, moving debris and ensuring nothing heavy could fall on them. The incident reminded them that their temporary safety was just that. Temporary. They could not rely on the building forever. Survival would require courage, determination, and careful planning. Brave. The day stretched on and the snow outside continued to coat everything in white. They decided to explore cautiously, checking the immediate area for more firewood, better shelter spots, or signs of danger. Each step outside the building was deliberate. The cold bit at their exposed skin, and the snow threatened to sink them into hidden drifts. Yet they moved carefully, marking landmarks as they went and collected what little resources they could find. Their movements were slow and deliberate, designed to conserve energy while maximizing safety. Back inside, they huddled near the fire, assessing the situation. They had made it through one night and part of a day, but they knew they were far from safe. The next challenge would be to continue the journey to real safety. The man suggested waiting until dusk, using the daylight hours to find the safest possible route. She agreed, though her eyes betrayed her worry. Each decision carried risk, death. Every choice could mean the difference between life and death. Yet, despite fear, they trusted each other implicitly, knowing that survival depended on unity and careful planning. As evening approached, the cold outside became sharper, darker, and more threatening. They reinforced the shelter, blocking gaps in the walls with spare branches and pieces of wood they had collected. The fire crackled faintly, providing a small circle of warmth and light. They knew they could not remain idle, but they also understood the importance of conserving energy for the final push. The wilderness outside demanded respect and careful strategy. Breath. They could not afford mistakes, hesitation, or panic. That night, as they rested near the fire, they reflected quietly on the ordeal so far. Breath. Every moment had been a test of endurance, courage, and trust. They realized that survival was not just about strength or skill, but about patience, careful observation, and the determination to keep moving despite fear and exhaustion. They had learned that small victories mattered. A few bites of food, a handful of water, a moment of warmth, or a safe place to rest. These victories built hope, and hope was a powerful tool in the fight for survival. But sleep finally took them in short, fragmented intervals. Even in rest, they remained alert, aware of the cold, the wind, and the world outside. The building offered temporary safety, but the true challenge lay ahead. Leaving this fragile shelter to face the wilderness. Again, tomorrow they would have to move. They would have to continue the journey, trusting their instincts, their planning, and most importantly, each other. By the time dawn approached, the man and woman were ready. They had survived another night, found warmth, and gathered strength. But they knew the real test was yet to come. The forest outside, still covered in ice and snow, awaited them with new dangers. Yet the experience of the past hours had strengthened their resolve. Every step, every decision, every act of courage had prepared them for the challenges ahead. They would face them together, stronger and more determined than before. The morning air was cold, but it carried a hint of hope. The snow had stopped falling, and the sky, though gray, seemed lighter than before. The man and woman stood at the threshold of the small building, stretching their stiff limbs and preparing for the final part of their journey. Their temporary shelter had kept them alive, but survival meant moving forward. They could not remain here any longer. Every second spent inside was a second lost in their race against the cold and exhaustion. They packed the few belongings they had carefully, checking and rechecking each item. The small bundle of food, their water supply, and a few essential tools were packed tightly into their backpacks. The man took the lead, scanning the surrounding forest for a safe path. The woman followed closely, relying on his guidance, trusting him implicitly. They had survived together through fear, storm, and exhaustion, and now they faced the final stretch toward real safety. The first steps outside were slow and cautious. Snow crunched under their boots, and the cold bit sharply at any exposed skin. The forest around them, though calmer than during the storm, still felt threatening. Every tree seemed to hide potential danger. Every slope could conceal a hidden drift. Every shadow could mask a misstep. They moved carefully, scanning constantly, aware that their strength had limits, round in disparity. Hours passed as they trudged through the deep snow. But hope grew with every movement. In the distance, they saw signs of civilization. A faint outline of a road, a wooden post sticking above the snow, and eventually, the roof of a small ranger station. Their hearts lifted at the sight. They had been walking for what felt like forever, but now the end of their ordeal was within reach. Energy surged within them, giving strength to legs that felt like lead. As they approached the ranger station, the woman stumbled, her legs weak from fatigue. The man caught her, holding her close and encouraging her to keep moving. "Almost there," he whispered. "Just a little more." Each step forward became a symbol of their determination, of the strength they had discovered in themselves and in each other. Breath. Every obstacle faced, every icy patch crossed, every night survived in the cold forest had brought them to this moment. The ranger station door was sturdy and welcoming. With trembling hands, the man pushed it open, and they stepped inside, feeling warmth wrap around them like a blanket. The small room smelled of wood and fire, and a faint light from a stove illuminated the space. They collapsed onto the floor, exhausted beyond measure but alive. Relief washed over them in waves, and for a moment, words were unnecessary. They simply breathed, feeling the comfort of safety after days of struggle. The ranger station was empty, but it offered more than just shelter. Firewood stacked neatly in a corner allowed them to build a proper fire. Water and canned food provided nourishment they had almost forgotten existed. Right. They tended to themselves, warming their hands and feet, drinking slowly, and eating carefully. Every bite, every sip, every moment of warmth was a reminder of the fragility of life and the preciousness of survival. As they rested, they reflected on their journey. The storm, the frozen rivers, the treacherous slopes, and the nights spent huddled together had tested them in ways they could not have imagined. Fear had been constant, exhaustion relentless, and hope sometimes almost gone. Yet, through it all, they had survived because of courage, determination, and the bond they shared. They realized that survival was not only about strength or skill, but about trust, persistence, and the refusal to give up even when the odds seemed impossible. The woman spoke softly, recounting moments that had terrified her, moments that had nearly broken her. The man listened, sharing his own memories and fears. They laughed quietly at small, almost absurd memories, and tears came freely at others. The shared experience had deepened their connection, creating a bond that could not be broken. They had faced the wilderness together and emerged stronger, and the relief of safety allowed emotions to flow freely for the first time. Even as they rested, they knew that the journey was not fully over. They would eventually have to leave the station, return to the world beyond the forest, and face life after the ordeal. But for now, they allowed themselves to simply exist in safety, to breathe without the constant fear of danger, to feel warmth without the pain of the cold. It was a rare moment of peace, and they cherished it deeply. In the afternoon, the man and woman prepared for the final leg of their journey. A ranger had arrived at the station, drawn by the faint smoke from the stove, and upon seeing them, rushed to help. Warm blankets, food, and medical attention brought a sense of security they had almost forgotten existed. The ranger listened carefully as they recounted their ordeal, amazed at the resilience and courage the two had shown. The forest had been unforgiving, but they had faced it together, relying on each other's strength and presence. With the ranger's guidance, they planned the route back to the nearest town. The journey was still challenging, but it was now tempered by hope and assistance. Each step forward was easier with the knowledge that help was nearby, that they no longer had to face the wilderness entirely alone. They moved cautiously but with confidence, their spirits lifted by the warmth of human care and the knowledge that they had survived the worst. As they walked toward the town, the man and woman reflected on everything they had learned. The ordeal had revealed strengths they had never known in themselves: patience, courage, determination, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. They had discovered the importance of trust and teamwork, realizing that even in the harshest conditions, human connection could provide strength and comfort beyond measure. Every step forward was a reminder of the power of perseverance. By the time they reached the edge of the forest, the snow was beginning to melt slightly, and the sky was lighter, almost warm in appearance. Trees that had once seemed menacing now appeared beautiful, their branches sparkling with frost in the gentle sunlight. The forest, though harsh, had taught them lessons that would remain forever, about survival, about hope, about the fragile and precious nature of life. They walked hand in hand, supporting each other with silent understanding, their hearts full of relief and gratitude. Finally, they reached the small town, greeted by friendly faces and the comforts of civilization. Warmth, food, and safety were abundant here, and for the first time in days they allowed themselves to truly relax. They recounted their journey to the townspeople, sharing every moment of fear, struggle, and courage. The townspeople listened with amazement, offering help, comfort, and admiration. The man and woman realized that the ordeal had not only tested their limits but had strengthened them in ways that would last a lifetime. As night fell, the man and woman sat together, reflecting on everything that had happened. The wilderness had been merciless, but it had revealed the depth of their strength and the power of human connection. They had faced the storm, the cold, the isolation, and the fear, and they had survived. Every choice they had made, every risk they had taken, every step forward had been a testament to courage and determination. They had discovered that survival was not just about enduring physical challenges, but also about mental strength, trust, and hope. In that quiet evening, with warmth surrounding them and safety finally assured, they realized the truth of their journey. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and sometimes harsh beyond imagination. But human courage and connection could overcome even the most impossible odds. They had survived not because of luck alone, but because they had refused to give up, because they had trusted each other, and because they had faced the wild with determination and heart. The man and woman looked at each other, smiles soft and grateful. They had faced the cold, the isolation, and the fear together, and now they could finally rest. The forest behind them had been harsh, unforgiving, and dangerous, but it had also been a teacher, revealing strengths they had never known. Thus, they had survived the impossible, and the lessons would stay with them forever. As they closed their eyes that night, safe and warm, they knew that life would continue with challenges ahead. But they had learned something vital. No matter how harsh the world could be, courage, trust, and determination could carry them through. They had survived together, and that bond forged in fear and snow would endure long after the forest was behind them.